Yeah. Good morning, everyone. I'm Yingjing Feng. I'm a PhD student from Lyric and University of Bordeaux. My supervisor is at Bitmont. And today I'm going to present the non-invasive mapping of atrial ectopic beats. So atrial fibrillation, we all know, is a very common disease, cardiovascular disease in clinics. And the main driver now, however, is still a mystery. So the current mainstream of studies suggests that AF drivers are two kinds. One is the focal source, which are the ectopic beats, and the second kind is rotational waves, such as rotors, reentries, or wavelets. And in 1998, Professor Michel Hesketh, he published a journal paper, very well known, which is suggesting that ectopic beats are mainly coming from pulmonary veins, and he established the PV isolation procedure to ablate the AF driver, and this has a significant impact in the clinical society. But later study suggests that actually there can be more AF drivers. As you can see in this chart here, that the follow-up suggests that after 18 months, the success rate has dropped to nearly 50%, and additional ablation based on invasive mapping has slightly more higher successful rates. Therefore, the quest of AF drivers are still continuing. And today I'm gonna present the non-invasive way to map the AF drivers, because mapping for AF is often time-consuming and sometimes even subjective. So non-invasive mapping can save time to locate these regions of interest. And however, solving ECGI is not an easy problem. It involves solving an impulse inverse problem. And as you can see, this is the electrogram on the heart. And when it goes to the torso surface, it becomes kind of smoothed out, and it's hard to identify what exactly happening in the heart. And also for the same pattern on the torso, it can actually be a result of different things happening on the heart. That is the main challenge for ECGI. However, ECGI still has been validated by various groups to show that they have a good resolution for atrial fibrillation, atrial flutter, and atrial tachycardia. This one published by Kuklish in Rudy's group in 2010, they showed that by pacing different sides on the atria, which is shown in the green circle, and they have been tagged by CARTO invasive mapping system, and then they use ECGI to identify these ectopic beats and compare the resolution, and they found a fairly good accuracy. So ECGI provides rotor and focal maps via phase maps and isochrone maps, and these figures show that this is a focal maps, because this is a focal because by following the wavefront, which is the showing blue, you can see that it has a waves coming from the center of the RIPV going outwards, and the rotors is a rotational waves. And in the isochrone, you can also identify the focal source and the rotational wave. And this study, especially, it used the rotor maps to identify an ablation lesion that later this AF is terminated. And then with this ECGI technology, people found that actually there are more drivers apart from the PV ectopic beats, that they have rotors and foci, which means foci can be also outside of the PV. And the Kukulic team, they also found that there are actually more sorts of drivers than rotors, such as wavelets, and yes, and the same. They also find focal size can be outside of PV, such as LA posterior wall. And because ECGI is hard to solve, we are now looking at imaging-free BSPM for AF mapping. This has been done extensively from Williams Group in Spain, that they did in dominant frequency mapping, like this chart, that's HO dominant frequency map, corresponds very well with the body surface potential map, the DF location and the distribution. However, the main challenge that because the dominant frequency, it relies on using FFT to produce a spectrogram, and this can be quite complex, hard to interpret the dominant frequency. And also, it needs to choose very carefully the high pass filter, because if you don't filter it following the filament of rotors, it can wander around. Whereas if you filter it correctly, or assumed to be correctly, it will provide kind of a nice filament location. So for ECGI or BSPM, it's actually quite a challenge to obtain experimental or patient data that involve that contain simultaneous mappings between a epicardium and torso recordings. So because of this, we resort to digital twins. And for the models, we are using the one published by Lombards in 2015, that there is a bi-layer bi-atrial model that includes the LA and RA indo and epicardium 2 layers, and also transmural heterogeneity. And there are also transeptal connections, such as Bachmann's bundle, fossa ovalis, and corona sinus, and added the sinus node. For the ionic model, use the Courtemanche model with enhancement of AF patients with acetylcholine distribution. And also we are looking at using universal atrial coordinates, because this is a way to map the 3D atrial surface to 2D space, so that it can provide a unified way to select regions of interest amongst different patient meshes. So for the EV classification, we model 3 things. First is re-entry types of atrial fibrillation and ectopic beats. And we also added acetylcholine, because ectopic beats can be a very idealized case for the study. So, and with added acetylcholine distribution, you can see the wave started to grow into little rotors. And using UAC, we also selected this conduction blocks or ectopic beat sites on various locations. and various lengths for the conduction blocks. And then we use modeling to calculate the surface ECG, including 12-lead ECG, 252-lead VESC, which is the model that Matron is using, and we are using them. And also we compute the torso leads, which is a higher resolution. And we use blind source separation to infer what's happening in the heart from the torso potentials. So this is formulated as given the signals on the torso, and there is a linear mapping between the source in the heart and the torso. We infer the source in the heart, and to do this, we use cumulant matrix, which is an autocorrelation function, and we use either Amuse or Solvi to extract their eigenvectors in order to extract the source in the atrium. And specifically in the conference paper by Computing Cardiology this year, that I used Solvi to extract the principal periodicity of the source, and then use Amuse to separate the source with regard to the tau. So later we'll calculate some feature to classify this ectopic bit. An example will be given a source, use Solvi to first extract them into different spectrum of periodicity, and because each source is correlated with eigenvalue, the largest means the most significant. We find we rank them and then find the one with the biggest eigenvalue, but yet has still a periodic source, and then we use them to use Amuse to see for each source how is the periodicity regarded the tau we extracted from Solvi, and then we sum them up, the ACF function, which is the autocorrelation function, to see the periodicity. And for re-entry, you will see the source has been very, very regular at the top ranked source. However, when it goes to lower ranked one, it's less periodic. Whereas for ectopic bit, it remains still fairly periodic, even in the lower ranked source. So that is the idea for separating the two sources. And the results show that this is resistance to different noises, and it also is insensitive to different recording systems, no matter if it's ECG or VESC or torso ESPM. And it also outperforms a single lead, which is V1 lead, FFT-based methods. And because it has a convergence for different K, it shows that we don't have to really be worried about how many sources we selected in estimating the blind source happening in the heart. So moving on, we instead of doing it for one patient, we're doing it for 4 patients' atrial meshes, and we paste the ectopic bits with different intervals. And we found that actually it can go a bit more complicated than what we presented previously, that the ectopic bits can coexist with other AF drivers, such as rotors and macro reentries. And rotors itself can also be regular. And here we give examples such as the simple ectopic bits and complex ectopic bits. It can both coming from the same pacing intervals, 180 milliseconds, which is a very common intervals for focal source. And by measuring the epicardium cycle length, the distribution for the simple one, it has a very concentrated distribution. Whereas for complex one, it has like a divergence between LA and RA. And for rotors, however, it can still has a concentrated distributions in the epicardial cycle length. And the electrogram also shows a very reasonably periodic behavior. And how do we separate these two to provide a reliable ground truth? We instead stop pacing the ectopic bits after 2000 milliseconds to test if the AF sustains. And we found the distribution for different intervals. Actually, this range has a very common. It's very common to happen that this complex ectopic bits phenomena would happen, and especially for LA. For RA, it has a different range of the sensitive ectopic bit interval. And an idea is that an example is that this is a very regular ectopic bits. You can see between bits they are the same. However, for complex one, if you see the coronal sinus between different bits, the wavefront actually diverge between bits. And once we stop pacing the ectopic bits, after 2000 milliseconds, we just let the wave to propagate by itself. See the one with the complex ectopic bits, it would sustain a macro reentry. Whereas this simple one, it just disappears. So that suggests that our blind spot separation techniques would need to be modified, and is no longer just a linear cut of the ectopic bits and rotors. So instead, we use machine learning, like different machine learning algorithms. So we first do a PCA to map the AEACF features obtained from the blind spot separation. And we can see that complex ectopic bits and rotors, they actually reside fairly close to each other, and ectopic bits are another two clusters. And using different algorithms, it's doing reasonably well, but not amazing. And for example, the decision tree is it seems to be the only case that can capture the complex ectopic bit. It still has quite a big confusion with the rotors type. So instead, we use the deep convolution neural network to classify the ectopic bits, and this is end-to-end, so we don't have to worry about blind spot separation. And this, we see that over 4 patients, it actually, compared to the blind spot separation plus the decision tree, it outperformed. and for different runs, the test loss are similar, show the similar pattern. So the future works would be to improve the stability of the deep neural network and trying to see if we can predict the locations of the ectopic bits from the BSPMs. However, this is very difficult because there are research showing that the heart and the heart geometry and orientation significantly affects the quality of ECGI. That means you need to use patient-specific geometry. And our methods, we don't use any geometry. So this, we are not pursuing precisions here, but more like to see how much we can reach using just the signals itself. And the third point would be integrate patient body surface. And Andy's talk on Monday is quite interesting that the CycleGAN seems to be able to improve the simulated data to be more realistic. So this would be the direction we are interested in. And finally, maybe we can use this classifier as a surrogate to improve the PVI outcome prediction. So that's my talk. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, Yingjing. And this presentation is open for discussions. We have time for 1 or 2 questions. Who has any questions for Yingjing? Ping, please.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Yeah, when you talk about the universal atrial coordinates, how do you map the 3D surface to the 2D space? Could you please talk a little bit more?
Yes, so this is, let me go back to the slide here. Yes, so this is done by identifying some critical location, such as the some like IVC and SVC, and we use a way to calculate the solution that you can think as defining such as IVC as 1 and UVC as UVC as 1 and IVC as 0, and then create a mapping from 0 to 1 in between. And so by identifying this boundary, we are able to create this 2D, sorry, I don't know why this comes a lot, this 2D coordinate systems. So the key idea is to create the boundary and calculate, like interpolate in between. And you can read this paper if you are interested.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? So Yingjing, when you talk about the PVI procedure, right? So you want to predict the PVI procedure. Should I consider this like a yes or no to stop AF? Or should I consider this also as a way to see if PVI can make the AF less complex?
Yes, so I think my direction for this problem is more like to know that because there are so many phenotypes for AF, so I would like to identify which subgroups are most effective for PVI and which are not. And like, let's say some patient has only focal source, so PVI I would imagine to be quite effective if this focal source happen to be only in the PV. But if you have focal source elsewhere and the PVI doesn't do the closure of that focal source is not effective. But yeah, so I think it just breaks down to different drivers groups, and to then correlate with the PVI outcome.
Okay.
And saying that I don't think directly classify the source is the BSPM itself to the outcome is easy. It gives us much insight. It can be really a black box, and it's very hard to interpret.
Okay, so it's more than a black and white effectiveness of a PVI procedure, because you can do a PVI procedure and then maybe drugs can help to terminate AF or maybe pacing.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you. We are a little